But what I wanted to share with you at the moment is an update on how I see everything that's happening sort of right now. As I said, there's a lot of change coming about, and let's take a look at what it all means. We have had 3% surcharge on buy-to-let and second properties and properties bought in a company imposed since March of this year. So let's have a look. We'll have a little look at some of the impact of that so far, because we've just had the first figures from HMRC Land Registry of how this change has actually impacted the property market since March of this year. There's some regulation coming in on the buy-to-let mortgage market. I want to explain a little bit about what that means for us, really. And there is the biggie, the Section 24 tax on mortgage interest, which is coming up in April 2017. And I'll share a few thoughts on that and what's likely to happen, if you like. And I'm going to put my neck out a little bit and give you a few predictions based on all of this as to how things might pan out over the next year or so. Starting with stamp duty. Well, this is the graph from the Land Registry data. And you can see, as predicted, there was a massive spike, because every man and their dog who could complete a deal before March 31st did. And you can see this massive spike in housing transactions in March. But you can see in this first quarter since, it is down. It is now. Some people will say, that, well, maybe Brexit has kicked into this. So we're probably going to, but I'm not really convinced, because I didn't really see much of a Brexit impact beyond the couple of weeks where the referendum and where there was uncertainty with who was forming the next government. But we're going to see over the next couple of quarters how this actually, whether this trend actually goes up or whether it stays in this sort of levels. The stamp duty that they brought in, the 3% surcharge that affects us, if you like, for second homes and buy-to-lets was this March. But before that, George Osborne changed the whole stamp duty system, which affected owner-occupiers and particularly affected high-value homes. Now, when you look at the detail behind this, transactions in the £1 million plus home market have fallen 12%. And total stamp duty revenues have actually fallen as well in this period. Not by much, but they have fallen. They haven't fallen that much because there's this massive spike. If you take out that spike, they've probably fallen quite a bit. But we're going to have to see a few more quarters of trend to see sort of what's happening. But one of the big issues that's affecting the owner-occupier market is if people in high-value houses are not moving, then people are not trading up. If you're living in a nice three-bedroom semi in Ealing or whatever, instead of moving to a detached, you're probably better off building a basement or something, because why pay the massive stamp duty in trading up? So the stamp duty issue is affecting homeowners and it's affecting the investor community. So we're going to have to see what happens over the next couple of quarters to see whether this trend continues. But this is going to be something to watch. At the moment, we can see it is down. So this is a graph that we're going to be looking at over the next few months. I want to talk a little bit about buy-to-let regulation and some changes that are coming in. Now, the Bank of England have announced a whole bunch of recommendations to lenders, a bit of an edict that they're asking them to conform to over the next few months. Now, one of them is that buy-to-let loans should be stress tested at 5% interest, 5.5% interest rate minimum, to cope with if interest rates were to rise. But the other thing that they've added, which is this interesting one, is they want a minimum rental coverage of 145%. And in their documentation, they've said that they don't view 125% rental cover as being enough, because you need a bit more to take into account the new tax that's coming in next year, the tax on mortgage interest. Now, the result of this, what this actually means, is that in areas which are low yielding, if you're looking at letting a property out, which is a single family let, and it's in a relatively low yield area where the yields are going to be about 5% or less, you're going to end up having to need 50% deposit to make that work. So for high value, low yielding areas, single family lets are simply just not going to be viable for people. The other thing that people have got to think about is the cash requirement to buy a property. So not only have you got the increased deposit because of the lower loan to values by this new stress testing, you've also got the stamp duty, because the extra stamp duty that you have to pay, you can't borrow. You have to fund that with cash. So it ups the initial cash requirement to buy a property in the first place. I think what we're going to see increasingly is that the single-family lets, particularly in the southeast, are just going to be a non-starter for people. It's going to be multi-lets, it's going to be things like service departments and high-value adds, and it's going to be property developing that are going to be the activities that are going to get you somewhere and make your profits. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this. This is actually an EU directive, which is called the Mortgage Credit Directive. Now, I know what you're going to say, we're out the EU now and all this sort of stuff. Well, we are, but the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, have said that they're going to implement this directive anyway because it's the sort of thing they wanted to do, and they're going to do it regardless of Brexit. But this doesn't really affect us as professional landlords, but it does throw a little bit of confusion into the ranks for professional portfolio investors who are thinking of incorporating their existing portfolios into a limited company. Now, I think all these changes, if you are going to do this professionally, any new purchases have definitely got to be done in a limited company, but your existing stuff has to be presented as a business and incorporated into a limited company. Now, this mortgage directive has sought to differentiate between consumer buy-to-let landlords and professional landlords. And this is the first time this distinction has been made. And this throws up an interesting, it shows up some interesting angles for us. The definition of a consumer buy-to-let landlord is this. It's when you take out a buy-to-let mortgage contract which is not entered into by the borrower wholly or predominantly for the purposes of a property business carried on or intended to be carried on by the borrower. Now, what this means is, in simple language, is that a consumer buy-to-let landlord is an accidental landlord. So let's say I lived in a flat and then I've moved out of town and I decide to rent out my former property that I lived in, then I'm deemed to be a consumer buy-to-let landlord. Or I inherit a property from my mum or something and I let it out. I'm an accidental landlord. I never got into buy-to-let with the intention of doing a business. The professional buy-to-let landlord is defined as someone who actually gets a buy-to-let mortgage for the specific intention of renting it out to a person not related to them for profit. And that's what it says. So for the first time, the FCA have actually differentiated between amateur or consumer buy-to-let landlords who have got into it accidentally and professional landlords, which kind of muddies the water and helps if you're thinking about incorporating your existing portfolio into a limited company. You have a definition which kind of defines you as a professional landlord if you've bought property with a buy-to-let mortgage for the intention of renting it out from day one. Does that make sense to people, yeah? So although this is an EU directive, the UK Financial Conduct Authority have said that they're going to implement it regardless of Brexit because it was the direction they were going in anyway. So if you've got a property that you formerly lived in and then you go to remortgage it, you will be deemed as an accidental landlord on that property, and you may have to come under the same kind of affordability scrutiny as if you're buying your own residence. That's what will happen to the consumer buy-to-let lending. And the fourth area I wanted to touch on was this Section 24. Now, I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into what it is, but in a nutshell, your mortgage interest costs are your biggest cost for most leveraged buy-to-let investors, and from April 2017, you are going to pay a tax on your biggest expense as though it was income, which is quite extraordinary. Now, this was brought in July last year by George Osborne, and it's amazing that this was July last year, and it's only 2 or 3 weeks ago that government have actually met with representatives from our community to listen to our side of the story, which is absolutely remarkable. Now, the housing minister that they met with was a small group of 5 people, and one of the people that met with the housing minister was Martin Skinner. So I'd like to invite Martin Skinner to share some of it. I've forgotten the name of the housing minister, as you've probably gathered. Just grab a mic from... Oh, you're on. Right, okay. Gavin Barwell. Yeah. So you met him. What was your agenda, if you like?
Well, I kind of feel as if I've become a semi-professional lobbyist recently. There are a few different things that I'm pushing for. My main focus actually has been on space standards to date, so I can produce my smaller apartments from new. But the majority of my customers in buying my smaller apartments are actually buy-to-let investors. Plus I have a stake in Property Tribes, social network for landlords, and I'm friends with Steve Bolton, who runs Platinum Property Partners, and I'm active in Croydon, and that's the largest part of my portfolio. Well, Gavin Barwell is MP for Croydon Central. The chap that set up the meeting, called Graham, is a Croydon resident, and he has buy-to-let properties in Croydon. Steve has franchise partners who are based in Croydon. So I guess I kind of went in as the person that was explaining the supply issue, while Steve went in with sort of 1 million properties behind him in terms of all the franchise partners that he supports. And Graham went in with the local component.
Could you just touch on that? Because many people here will be already familiar with the issue that affects buy-to-let landlords. But the supply issue is an interesting angle which people may not be familiar with. Could you just summarise that for the problem?
Yeah, so this dovetails with the stamp duty on buy-to-let as well. I got invited into, not the Treasury, HMRC, to talk about this. When they were consulting on it, albeit their consultation was only scheduled to finish a week before the policy came into force. So there wasn't going to be any change to that. Yeah. And I explained it was a room full of lawyers primarily, and some quite young guys from HMRC. And I explained, although our product is designed for first-time buyers, actually, because we need to borrow the money to build the schemes out, and schemes take longer than the mortgage window, which is 6 months. Your mortgage offer will only be valid for 6 months maximum generally. First-time buyers can't commit outside that period, and owner-occupiers generally won't be able to afford to take the risk of committing without a valid mortgage. It takes longer than 6 months to build, typically 12 to 18 months to build a scheme out. And therefore it's buy-to-let investors that typically commit prior to that. Well, we need as a developer generally at least 25 to 50% sales exchanged in order to draw the money down from a lender to build. So if they hit the buy-to-let market too hard, and actually any significant change will make a big difference there, then they're just killing off supply. They're not benefiting owner-occupiers and first-time buyers. They're actually hurting both buy-to-let, which supplies the rental stock, and they're hurting the first-time buyers because their homes won't get built in the first place. And that seems to be where I think the opportunity is to really drive home a change to the policy. They are sensitive to it. Gavin Barwell, actually, I've been very impressed with every time I've met him. And I haven't been very impressed with any housing ministers post Mark Prisk. And I think he's going to stay there for quite a while. He's got a long background, actually, in doing work related to housing. very smart guy, works very hard, listens very well. I don't think anything's going to change immediately, but certainly I got a much better hearing there than I have done previously. And I think if anyone's got research that could go in, you know, I'm a small player relative to all the big house builders, but I've managed to get them to listen to me, and I'd encourage other people to really get stuck in with their local MPs, and if you can get to ministers, then do. And if you can demonstrate that this will affect supply, and that will affect rents, and it will affect the availability of homes and affordability of homes to first-time buyers and owner-occupiers, I think they are listening. And post-Brexit, they're more sensitive to changes that will damage the market than they were before. And there's a new team in place. They're more able and willing to make changes now. So I think it's the right time to really drive it home.
I know also you talked to the Housing Minister about a possible compromise solution rather than a U-turn, just applying the new rules to new loans. Could you talk us through that and how receptive they were to the logic of that argument?
Yeah, so that was Steve's suggestion. I was pushing for it to be
U-turned
generally. Yeah. New leadership, why not sort it in one fell swoop? But he did seem to be quite receptive to Steve's suggestion, which was, it's not fair to apply this retrospectively to people that have built up their portfolios over time and they're dependent upon it. So if you are going to follow through with it, then can't you at least remove the retrospective nature of it? And that gives new investors buying or people buying new properties the opportunity to structure it as a business, if that's what they're considering, to separate the two. So, that's kind of a fallback if they don't cancel it altogether.
And of course, there's the legal challenge going ahead. Did you get the sense that they were quaking in their boots, or?
No, not at all. I think they're quite detached from things like that. But certainly, I think if the judicial review was successful, they would probably prefer that than to have to actually change anything and U-turn themselves. Mm-hmm. One other key point is that it's actually not the housing minister's place to make the decisions on taxation policy. That's Treasury. So a focus on Hammond, not the one from Top Gear, would probably be a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Big hand for Martin and his input there. I think it's as I said, no one was actually talking to anyone in this community before, so it's some progress. And of course, some people may know that Philip Hammond George Osborne came from a different sort of background. He didn't really sort of do much commercially. But Philip Hammond has actually run a property development company. He has buy-to-let investments in a limited company, though. But he's at least sympathetic to and understands the process and the business that we have. I said I was going to stick my neck out and make a few predictions. So I'm going to kind of say a couple of things for what it's worth. In terms of Section 24, this whole thing, tax on our mortgage interest payments, I think it's highly unlikely that this is going to be scrapped before it starts to kick in 2017. It's just too short a time frame. I think there may be change, but it's not going to happen in that time frame. I think the best policy for all of us is to plan for the worst and hope for the best. There will be change, but we don't know whether it's going to be too late if you don't do any planning at all up front. I think, as Martin said as well, I think the whole Brexit thing and the change in the top team is actually not a bad thing. It is far harder for someone that came up with the policy, like George Osborne, to admit they were wrong and turn back on it. But once the proverbial starts hitting the fan and the effect of the property market starts to happen, if you like, the last thing a new chancellor wants is to deal with the shit left on the doorstep by their predecessor. So I think from a sort of psychology point of view, they'll be far more receptive to deal with it. The question is, do they want to see the evidence of the impact on the market first, or will they take the evidence that is being put forward by people like Martin and his team before actually seeing the result for themselves? Who knows? I think, I've heard this mentioned by quite a few people, that one of the things that Hammond may be looking at, particularly post-Brexit, is to phase this in over a longer period. So don't be surprised if there's some sort of announcement that says, hey, instead of it's going to be phased in between 2017 to 2020, it suddenly becomes 2022. Because it gives people a longer planning horizon to get their affairs in order. The other thing that I think is quite sensible, as Martin touched on as well, we all want this to be overturned completely, but there is something retrospective about this rule change, in that if you got a mortgage 5 years ago, you did so under the rules that were in place at that time. If you got it, you may be subject to redemption penalties. It may be hard to get out of those loans to do something else. So it is very, very unfair that you went into a financial decision based on rules that have suddenly been changed. So there is a logical argument to say that new rules should be applied to new loans. And I think in terms of U-turns, governments don't like U-turns because it's a face-saving issue. And what we may see is that if they were to change this policy to new rules for new loans, then it'll be something that won't be picked up as a U-turn. I think the press are having a difficulty understanding this whole problem anyway. So this will just be seen as a technicality and just probably be brushed under the carpet if they decide to make this change. But this change will not be seen as a U-turn, but it will obviously have a big effect on us. I don't know whether people are familiar with what happened in Ireland. They actually did this in Ireland in the 1990s, I think, where they implemented the same rule and they did new rules for new loans, but it was a complete disaster, and they repealed that just a few years later. And the other thing I'm going to stick my neck out in is I think after a few quarters of data, I think we will see, we are highly likely to see a change to this 3% stamp duty surcharge, because it doesn't make any sense. Transaction volumes are coming down. It's not just transactions volumes are coming down, it's the number of transactions of properties sold in the southeast, because the biggest stamp duty take for the HMRC is from homes in the southeast. It's disproportionate compared to the rest of the country. And it's sales in those areas which have fallen the most. And when they start seeing that the increase in stamp duty is deterring people from selling, then a few quarters evidence, I reckon there could be a change here that we're looking at. Martin, can I just invite you to comment on anything that I've said?
Yeah, that was one of the things that Steve brought up, actually, the Irish experiment that failed. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that I think they're going to scrap both.
Which both?
Both the stamp duty, SDLT surcharge, and the mortgage relief loss. But that's possibly a bit optimistic.
Well, listen, I hope I'm wrong. I want to be wrong on this one.
Neither of them make any logical sense. And at the recent Resi conference in Wales, Gavin did his first sort of public speech as housing minister, and he did talk about clearly government policy shifting from being almost entirely focused on first-time buyer homes and in favour of supporting the market much more broadly. He talked about build to rent, but he was referring to other things as well. He mentioned Pocket, who of course produce micro apartments under the affordable housing category. And I think he was certainly listening on buy-to-let. I think he understands that a lot more than maybe people give him credit for. I've emphasised to him, build to rent is great. It's really good that professional or institutions are coming in as PRS. But buy-to-let is 2 trillion, existing buy-to-let. It's much more significant than the possibly might be 20, 30, 40, 50 billion over 5 or 10 years. You've really got to look at that bit if you want to get the supply in and reduce, or at least reduce the rate of growth of rent. So I think he's going to, well, I would hope they drop both. Doesn't make any sense to me not to.
It doesn't make any sense. I think that's the that's the underlining thing here. But it's just persuading the powers that be that is the case.